Okay, thank you everyone for attending today's public meeting to discuss the Oregon-Jackson Street Bridge in the city of Oshkosh. My name is Bill Bertrand. I am the WisDOT project manager on this study, and I'm sharing my video momentarily so that you can connect a face to the voice. Before we get started, I would like to go through a few housekeeping items. Our meeting is being recorded for the purpose of preparing minutes for the meeting. We'd ask that you would please mute your microphones or phones until after the presentation to avoid ancillary audio that could affect the presentation for others. Please ensure that if you don't want to share video of yourself, that you double check your web camera is not live. Questions, comments, or discussions will take place after the presentation so as not to interrupt the flow of the presentation. With that, I'm going to share my screen. Questions and comments can be shared through various options, uh, and everyone should be able to see my screen right now. Please feel free to use the chat function that's shown along the top window in the chat bubble. If you type in your comment, it'll appear in the lower right corner. Type it in and we will have a team member monitoring the chat window for any questions that come in during the presentation. Second option to ask questions after the chat window would be using the raise your hand function. Again, in the reactions bubble on the top of the screen, by clicking the raise your hand feature, we will be able to see the hand raised next to the name on the participant window. When you have your question answered, we would ask that you just lower your hand so that we know your question has been addressed. After addressing the questions by those with hands raised, we will then take questions and comments from those on the phone or those who don't have access to the Teams functions. I'd like to introduce a number of our department staff that are here this evening, as well as some of our consultant design team members. On the department side, we have Tom Buchholz, who's our deputy region manager. We have our product development chief, Tim Rank, supervisor for Winnebago County, Tammy Raby, and we also have our region communication managers, Mark Cantola and Missy Cook. On our design team, the DOT has consulted with a team of HDR and Kapoor and Associates. From HDR, we have Rob Moses and Catherine Biesman. And from Kapoor and Associates, we have Don Albright, Justin Arndt, and Lindsay Schmidt. Uh, I do not see any state legislators or representatives on the call, but if there are any, it has certainly given an opportunity to introduce yourself at this time. Okay. Uh, Today's meeting is to provide information on alternatives and schedule and to gather feedback from the local officials, stakeholders, businesses, and the general public. Knowledge of any community events, any area improvement projects, or any other factors that may affect the scope and schedule of our project would be beneficial, and we'd ask that you would certainly bring them up. If you do have questions or comments you think of when you get home or after the meeting, please email or call us. We will have contact information at the end of the presentation. And as a reminder, we'd ask that you continue to mute your mics through the presentation until we get to the question and comment session. So with that, I am going to take a second here and I'm going to load the PowerPoint presentation. And everyone now should be able to see my screen. So again, we are here tonight to discuss the Oregon-Jackson Street Bridge project. This is our third public involvement meeting on the project. The presentation tonight will cover a little bit of the project history. It will also get into the project purpose and need, current design alternatives, and we will touch on the schedule, both the environmental schedule as well as any potential real estate acquisition that would occur under some of the proposed alternatives. And then lastly, the construction schedule where it's currently sitting. Our project is located downtown Oshkosh, one of four bridges that cross the river in the downtown area. Congress Street or Highway 21 is off the map to the west, but then you can see Wisconsin Street, Highway 44 just to the west of Oregon Jackson, and Main Avenue or Main Street, Highway 45 just to the east of Jackson Street. The purpose of our project is to continue providing a safe, reliable crossing for Oregon Jackson Street across the Fox River, and any improvement needs to address uh, structural and geometric deficiencies of the existing bridge to maintain safe access for all users of the bridge that include not only motorists, but bicyclists, pedestrians, and also waterway users. And then we would also look that our improvement alternative would comply as much as possible with state, regional, and local plans, including any city redevelopment planning. A little bit of background and history. The existing bridge was constructed in 1956. Generally, we look at about a 75-year life for a bascule bridge, so it is getting to the point where it's nearing its service life. There was a report that was done back in 2012 that showed a number of bridge deficiencies that needed to be addressed. We did begin an environmental study back in 2015 that included some early stakeholder meetings to help identify some critical local issues. And on the right side of the current slide, you can see a number of stakeholder meetings as well as local official and public involvement meetings that have occurred thus far in the project. The study was suspended in 2017. At that time, we reevaluated the bridge condition, and it looked like we could gain an additional 6 to 7 years of bridge life at that time. So we tentatively delayed construction to a 2028 timeframe with the idea that we would relook at the condition of the bridge in early 2021 for the potential of restarting the study. Our design team uh, did do a survey and inspection of the bridge in April of 2021 with our region bridge engineers, confirmed that 2028 construction was a reasonable time frame given the condition of the bridge. And in the summer of 2021, we did then resume our environmental study. The project is needed to improve and address a number of areas, bridge deficiencies in operation, which go hand in hand with safety. I'm not going to go into detail on the bridge deficiencies that exist out there. Our project website, which again is shown at the end of the presentation, does include a little more detail on the bridge deficiencies, but suffice to say the movable bridge machinery is showing some signs of wear and corrosion, and it is in need of replacement. Uh, the approach spans and sidewalks also are in need of repair, and there is some cracking and spalling on concrete surfaces underneath and the bridge piers. Uh, as part of a lot of our early outreach back in 2015, again with the stakeholder groups, there were four areas that really were identified by that group and confirmed in talking with local officials that needed to be addressed by any improvement alternative. The first area was improving bicycle and pedestrian accommodations. Uh, any new bridge, we look at a 6-foot sidewalk width being standard. The existing bridge has 5-foot sidewalk width on the approaches, and across the center or bascule lift span, it's actually less than 5 foot. So any of the new bridge alternatives that we will be discussing tonight do include not only 6-foot sidewalks, they also include 5-foot bike lanes on either side of the travel lanes. The second area that was identified, again by early coordination, was the navigation clearance. The existing clearance at Oregon Jackson Street is 8 to 9 feet, which is more than 2 feet less than the Wisconsin Street or Highway 44 bridge to the west. And back in 2015, the Oregon Jackson Street Bridge actually opened roughly 400 more times than Wisconsin Street, which not only creates more wear and tear on the existing bridge, but is certainly also an inconvenience to vehicle traffic in the downtown area. Uh, the third area that was looked at was better accommodating the Riverwalk. The city of Oshkosh has done a lot of work in developing Riverwalk along both the north and the south shore of the Fox River. Currently, bicyclists and pedestrians need to cross both at grade and in a mid-block situation on both the north and south side of the Fox River. So there's certainly a need and desire to improve the situation for the Riverwalk, which would also improve safety for pedestrians that are utilizing that. And then the last area that was identified as a need was that any improvement alternative needed to minimize impact to development, and that would be both existing development out there today as well as proposed development that may occur in the future. So at this point in our study, we're looking at 10 remaining improvement alternatives that are under consideration. There's a wide range within those alternatives. Uh, they range anywhere from a no-build alternative to a rehabilitation alternative, and then there are 8 replacement alternatives, 4 of which are high-level fixed bridge alternative, and 4 of which are a lift bridge alternative with a in the navigation channel in the center of the river with a span that opens and closes. The slide currently shows alternative A, which is the no build, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on that in the presentation, except to say that the no build does not meet the purpose and need of the project, but it does serve as a baseline to measure any of the improvement alternatives against within our environmental document. Alternative B is a rehabilitation alternative. Uh, on the screen, you can see the area in pink, which is essentially the limits of the existing structure. Under this alternative, that would also be the limits of the overall project. We do address the structural deficiencies with this project or with this alternative, but really only the structural deficiencies are addressed. There are no changes to the existing features, and we do not address the really 3 of the 4 local issues that were identified, meaning improving bicycle and pedestrian accommodations, improving navigation clearance, and improving the current situation with the Riverwalk. It is worth mentioning that under this alternative, the state or the Department of Transportation would maintain bridge ownership, and we'll get a little bit into how that compares to other alternatives with a slide later in the presentation. But also this alternative has roughly a 25-year lifespan with it. At the end of that 25-year life, we would then be looking at the need for a replacement alternative. We'll get into now the 8 replacement alternatives. Uh, Before we get into in detail the alternative that's shown on the screen, we'll mention that really what the 8 improvement alternatives, the replacement alternatives have in common is that they all have a 4% profile on the approaches, which is generally considered the maximum for vehicles that are stopping or decelerating in advance of a stop condition. The existing grade on the bridge today is 4.8%. So any of the 8 improvement alternatives, the replacement alternatives that we discuss, will be an improvement over the existing condition. Uh, Also, any of the 8 replacement alternatives do, as we mentioned before, improve conditions for bicycles and pedestrians. They do have 5-foot bike lanes, 6-foot sidewalks. Uh, at a minimum, all 8 replacement alternatives do improve navigation clearance by a minimum of 2.2 feet to make it consistent with the Wisconsin Street Bridge to the west. And 7 of the 8 replacement alternatives do provide a grade separation for the Riverwalk on both sides underneath of a new bridge. Also, for any of the replacement alternatives, the city of Oshkosh would assume ownership of the bridge after the replacement. And again, we'll touch on that a little more later in the presentation. So specific to alternative C1 that is currently shown on the screen, uh, the structure replacement limits are shown in pink. The road replacement or road reconstruction limits are shown in green. So this is a high-level fixed span alternative. The southern limits are just north of 6th Avenue on the South Shore, and on the north side of the river, the reconstruction limits do extend through the Marion Road intersection. The navigation clearance under this alternative has been coordinated with the U.S. Coast Guard and right now is set at 23 feet navigation clearance, which is also consistent with the I-41 bridge further to the west of our project. A couple of things to mention worth noting with this alternative, we would be looking at a 2-year construction window with it. This alternative does realign Division Street on the north side of the river to form a new intersection with Marion Road. That's also including acquisition of the current Chamber of Commerce building. Uh, Access to Beckett's and the parking ramp does change significantly. We would construct a cul-de-sac off of Division Street that would then provide access to Beckett's, as well as with a short curve section up to the parking ramp. This would be 2 separate driveways that would come off the cul-de-sac. It's also worth noting, and we'll give a brief summary of the parking impacts with each of the alternatives. There's a parking area on the south for Beckett's that's shown some removed parking on the display. There's a net loss of 16 parking spots in the Beckett's or the southern parking lot with this alternative. In the northern parking lot, which is on more the center city property and just to the north of the parking ramp, we are looking at a net loss of 4 spots in that area. So overall, this alternative would look at a net loss of 20 parking spots and all north of the river along the east side. We will move next into alternative C3, which is another high level fixed span, fixed bridge option. Again, I'm not going to cover the things that are similar to C1, the previous alternative, because this is very similar. It's another on alignment fixed bridge option. The difference with C3 is how the access to both Beckett's and the city center are treated with this alternative. So access to Beckett's and the parking ramp would be directly via Jackson Street. The thing that's difficult to visualize, looking at a 2-dimensional plan sheet as this is where the current access comes to the parking ramp doesn't change, but we're roughly 7 to 7.5 feet above existing ground at this location. So the entire area for the parking ramp coming out to Jackson Street would have retaining walls on both the north and south side of this driveway. And then there would be an offshoot really for the Beckett's parking lot that would again be in that 7 to 7.5 feet, probably above existing ground range, where it meets with the parking ramp and tapers then down to meet with existing ground where our alternative shows it ending. So there's retaining walls really along the access to Beckett's as well as to the parking ramp. The southern parking area under this alternative, that again would be the area by Beckett's, would have a net loss of 34 parking spots, largely due to the fact that, again, the access to Beckett's starts above grade and has to come down to grade, so we're losing parking in that entire area. On the north side by the city center, we actually have a net gain of 5 spots, but overall then for this alternative, we are losing 29 parking spots, which is more than alternative C1. Next alternative that we'll give a brief overview of is alternative E. Under this alternative, we are looking at a replacement lift bridge similar to what exists today with the lift span in the center of the Fox River and the navigation channel. On the south side, our reconstruction limits would stop roughly halfway between 6th Avenue and the south riverbank. And on the north side, our limits do stop just on the edge of the Division Street intersection with Jackson. So we would not be realigning Division Street or reconstructing either the Marion or the Division Street intersection with Jackson. This alternative, again, would be a 2-year closure for the Bascule Bridge work. It does improve the navigation clearance by 2.2 feet to match Wisconsin Street to the west. However, that raise is not sufficient enough to allow for a grade separation for either riverwalk. So either on the north or south side, the riverwalks would still be crossing at grade with Oregon Jackson Street. This is the only one of the 8 replacement alternatives that does not fully grade separate the Riverwalk from Oregon Jackson Street. With this alternative, the Beckett's access stays generally in the same location as today. As well, the parking ramp access also stays in essentially the same location as today. Given that we're not raising the elevation of Oregon Jackson Street as much, those parking or those entrance locations are not impacted to the extent of some of the other alternatives. For the parking impacts on this alternative, on the south side for Beckett's, we are looking at a net loss of 4 spots. And in the north side of the existing parking ramp in the city center, there is no change to the parking. So overall, we're looking at a loss of 4 parking spots with this alternative. The next alternative is another lift bridge option. It's alternative F as it's labeled. Looks very similar, at least from an aerial view, to alternative E. The difference here is that we are raising the elevation of Oregon Jackson Street in the navigation channel by an additional foot. So it's roughly 3.2 foot additional or improved navigation clearance. What that does is gives the clearance that we need to fully grade separate the river walks on the north and south side of the Fox River. Uh, so on paper, this has the additional benefit over alternative E of the Riverwalk separation with very similar otherwise construction impacts. The one change here, certainly looking at access again to Beckett's and City Center. Uh, the Beckett's driveway, while it would be still remain direct to Jackson Street, it does shift actually up to the location of where the parking ramp currently exists today, and we would provide a short offshoot from the parking ramp access to serve the Beckett's parking area. So the front row of parking for Beckett's is shown crosshatched as an area that does lose some parking under this alternative. The parking on the south side does show a net loss of 16 parking spots. Again, north of the parking ramp, we have no change to the parking impacts. So with alternative F, there's a change or a net loss of 16 parking spots overall. We'll move on to alternative J1. This is again another bascule or lift bridge replacement option. So the span again in the center of the river would raise and lower similar to what it does today. The really push behind this option was looking to minimize the impacts to traffic during construction. This is similar to a concept that was done in Winneconne recently, where that lift bridge was replaced on new alignment. Uh, the idea behind it is that the bascule or the lift span in the middle of the river takes 2 years to build, and the approach spans really only take 1 year to build. So by putting the lift span on new location, while the overall construction will take 2 years, the first year of construction is on new location and doesn't impact existing traffic. This is also similar to what's ongoing right now in the city of Menasha with the Racine Street Bridge in that construction project. This alternative, again, even though it's on new alignment, the southern construction limits do stop roughly again halfway between 6th Avenue and the South Bank. On the north side, due to the realignment, our reconstruction limits do extend through the Marion Road intersection. So we would be, again, reconstructing division, realigning division to form a new intersection with Jackson and Marion Road. This alternative, again, as we mentioned, does provide great separation for both riverwalks. Beckett's and the parking ramp have similar access, uh, while again, the profile is slightly elevated by shifting Oregon Jackson to the west, a little away from the Beckett's and City Center area. We do allow access at Beckett's to remain very close to where it is existing, and the parking ramp access is also stays at the current location. The parking on the south, actually under this alternative, does gain 9 spots, and you can see where the spots are somewhat gained, and due to the fact that we're shifting this area to the west is what allows some parking spots to be gained. And then on the north side, in the city center parking north of the parking ramp, we're looking at a net gain of 5 parking spots. So overall, we gain 14 parking spots for the Beckett's and city center property with this alternative. Alternative J2, very similar again to the previous alternative. I won't review what they have in common, but the differences here really are on the north shore or on the north side of the river, where we have a cul-de-sac for Division Street. So there is no relocation of the Chamber Building. There is no reconstruction of the Marion Road intersection with Jackson Street, but we add a new cul-de-sac for Division on the east side of Jackson Street. Again, access to Beckett's stays in the essentially the same location. Uh, we again gain 9 spots with this alternative in the south parking area. Uh, the difference, again, we do have some loss of parking because of the cul-de-sac on Division with alternative J2. So there's a net loss of 8 parking spots on the north parking area. So overall for the alternative, there's a gain of 1 parking spot. The last 2 of the replacement alternatives that we will discuss are high-level fixed alternatives that are what we call on a partial offset. And these are both alternatives that were relatively recently developed. The idea behind this alternative is we did not hear a lot of negative comments from either the public or the local officials about a 2-year overall traffic closure with a replacement alternative in the earlier study. And a lot of that is likely due to the fact that the Wisconsin Street Bridge to the west and the Main Street Bridge to the east provide alternative options for river crossings very close to Oregon Jackson. So our thoughts being if the 2-year closure was not as big of an issue as we thought it might be, we were going to look to more split the right of way with this option to uh, move away from Beckett's in the city center, but not to so far that we would require additional real estate along the west side of the roadway. So we're still not requiring or needing to acquire any right of way on the west side, but we're shifting the roadway uh, 20 to 25 feet to the west to minimize impacts on the Beckett's and city center property. Again, with this alternative, we are looking at a 23-foot navigation clearance that we have validated with the Coast Guard. Mentioned again a 2-year closure, realigning Division Street to form a new intersection with Marion Road. And again, access to Beckett's and the city center would be via a short cul-de-sac that would access to Division Street with separate driveways off of the cul-de-sac to Beckett's, as well as a sharp curve then to come up the parking ramp. Uh, Change in parking impacts with alternative M1 on the south side, again with the slight shift to the west of the main roadway. We do look at gaining 13 parking spots in the Beckett's or the south parking area. And while there is some lost parking on the north side of the parking ramp, we also mitigate that a little bit and we can keep the parking loss to only 4 spots on the north side. So overall, alternative M1 does show a gain of 9 parking spots for the property along the east side and north of the river. Alternative M2, another high-level fixed option, very similar to the previous. And again, I won't go through again what's similar to the previous, but the differences Here is how we provide access again to Beckett's and City Center property. Uh, Similar to alternative C3, we're looking at a direct access to Jackson Street for the parking ramp, but this again is going to be in the vicinity of 7 to 7.5 feet above existing ground where it meets in with Jackson Street. So there will be again retaining walls along both sides of this access that comes to the parking ramp. There will again be a driveway for Beckett's that comes off of this uh, parking ramp access and gradually comes down to existing elevation uh, with retaining walls again along a portion of that portion of the drive. The area in pink, again showing lost parking. We are looking at a net loss of 13 parking spots on the south area, due again primarily to the fact that we're above existing ground and need to bring the Beckett's access gradually down to existing elevation. And then on the north side, we're actually able to gain 5 spots. So overall, alternative M2 does provide or does limit the parking spots lost to 8 spots lost. So what we tried to do, and that's a lot of alternatives that we kind of went through a lot of various details. Uh, what we've tried to do is to use one matrix or one spreadsheet that shows all the alternatives and the kind of benefits, pros and cons for each of the alternatives, comparing them on one sheet of paper. Uh, what we have on this slide does also show the alternatives that were developed back in 2015 and 16 and have been removed from the study for various reasons. So there's a lot going on here, but we did want to at least show that there were a number of previous alternatives that had been investigated. This matrix can be viewed on our design website, which is shown in the last slide. But for ease of reviewing things tonight, we're going to move to the next slide, which condenses the matrix to just the 10 alternatives that are remaining. The alternatives that are shown in blue background are alternatives that were developed during our study in 2015 and 2016. The alternatives that are shown in green background are the 3 alternatives that have been developed within the last year since we've resumed our environmental study. Uh, the areas that we looked at to compare the alternatives one against the other really go back to starting with uh, the stakeholder items, the 4 items that were developed from that stakeholder group, and 3 of those 4 were multimodal access across the river, navigation clearance, and accommodating the city riverwalk. So you can see in the matrix that 3 of the first 4 columns here really address those areas and how each of the improvement alternatives do address those areas. The alternative A, do nothing, and the structure rehabilitation option do not improve in those 3 areas, while the 8 replacement alternatives, for the most part, uh, the only alternative option E for the Riverwalk is the only alternative that falls short of accommodating and getting a yes in the column for these 3 areas. Magnitude of environmental impacts really is looking at impacts in the water, impacts to adjacent property, change in aesthetics or landscape, future ownership. And again, the next slide that we get into will touch on this a little more, uh, but under the rehabilitation and do nothing option, which really has been is only along for comparison purposes, the state maintains ownership. Under any of the 8 improvement or the replacement alternatives, the city assumes ownership. And then construction time frame, 1 year for the rehabilitation, 2 years construction time frame for any of the replacement alternatives. Again, with the slight disclaimer that alternatives J1 and J2, while they take 2 years to build, will only impact traffic for 1 year. And then relative cost, and again, we'll touch on that in the next slide, but relatively low cost, and this is relative for the alternatives to each other, so that the structural rehabilitation is not a low cost, but relative to the other alternatives, it certainly is. So low for the rehabilitation, medium relative cost for the high level fixed span alternatives, and a high level relative cost for the bascule bridge replacement alternatives. Funding considerations, and while there may not be a lot of words on this slide, this is maybe the most important slide throughout the presentation to pay attention to. The first bullet indicates that the state will fully fund either a rehabilitation option, which was alternative B, or a lowest cost replacement structure. And what that essentially means, translating, is that any of the high level fixed bridge alternatives or the rehabilitation option would be fully funded with federal state funds. Uh, if the overwhelming preference in the city prefers as well to look at a lift bridge replacement option, the additional costs over and above the high level fixed bridge option would be 100% the responsibility of the city of Oshkosh. Uh, Based on preliminary and current costs, we're looking at that cost to be in the ballpark of $25 million. So that $25 million additional cost over and above what the cost would be for a high level fixed bridge is what the city of Oshkosh would need to pick up if a bascule bridge is the preferred alternative for a replacement. So that would be alternative uh, J1, J2, and then E and F are the four bascule bridge replacement options that would involve that, again, generally $25 million range. And we'll put the disclaimer on that, that is a cost estimate that's preliminary. We're early in the study, and there's also certainly inflation that could impact that cost difference going forward. The second bullet does mention that the replacement options, or any of the 8 replacement options, does trigger a jurisdictional transfer of the bridge from the state to the city. So after the construction is complete, uh, if any of those 8 alternatives are selected to move forward, the bridge would become the ownership of the city of Oshkosh. This corresponds with State Statute 84-10 that was passed in 1989. And that state statute dictates that any bridge on a local street or connecting highway transfers to local ownership after it is replaced. The third bullet statement is the city will assume operation and maintenance costs of a new structure. So if the jurisdictional transfer takes place under any of the replacement options, then the city in the future has to operate or cover the operation and maintenance costs of a new structure. While we can't forecast what those costs will be in the future, we have provided city officials historical costs for 2021. Those maintenance costs were in the vicinity of $150,000. Those costs do represent both bridge tenders' wages as well as some repairs that were done to the bridge. And actually, the majority of those costs are bridge tenders' wages. One thing to mention, certainly for a new bridge, those costs may be slightly less in the first years after a new bridge is open to traffic, but certainly under a high level pre-stressed girder option, those maintenance costs would be much, much less because there are no bridge tenders wages that need to be covered under that option. So the maintenance costs are essentially slashed to very little with a high level fixed bridge option, except for your standard rehabs during the life of a bridge. And then the other thing to mention is, while it's not part of our specific project, the department is implementing remote operations in the Oshkosh area for the 4 bridges that are over the Fox River. And that essentially means that the Wisconsin Street Bridge will be the hub for operating all 4 bridges in the downtown area, and assuming that Oregon Jackson would remain a lift bridge. So the Congress or Highway 21 bridge, Wisconsin Street Bridge and the main street or Highway 45 bridge would all be operated from Wisconsin Street. And if Oregon Jackson would stay as a lift bridge, then that would as well be operated from Wisconsin Street. So there would be some sharing of the bridge tenders' wages due to the fact that there is consolidated operations. Uh, what that agreement would actually be worked out would be something that the state would have to work with city officials on final costs for that. Uh, and if I didn't mention, one other thing I'll mention now, uh, a rehabilitation alternative has roughly a 25-year span for a life, after which it needs to be replaced. Any of the 8 replacement alternatives, we are looking at roughly a 75-year life, again, for a replacement alternative. Uh, give a little bit of an idea on the overall schedule. We mentioned not just for the environmental study, but also subsequent stages. We did start the environmental study back in 2015, suspended work from really late 2017 to mid 2021. Now we've resumed that study. We are looking to have a draft environmental document by the summer of 2023, working toward approval in early 2024. Uh, if real estate is required with the alternatives that would move forward, we would look at likely late spring of 2025, starting real estate acquisition. And we have a 2-year window to acquire real estate so that the acquisition would be complete by late spring of 2027. And that would allow time uh, prior to construction for any utility relocation. So that year gap is not really a gap because there are utility relocations that would be occurring. And then with construction starting in the summer of 2028. Uh, Again, any of the replacement alternatives, we're looking at roughly a 2-year construction window. So probably late 2030 is when we would look to be complete with construction. And with that, I am going to turn things over to, I believe, Mark Cantala for a brief review of the department's resources for business. So Mark, I don't know if you want to come on to go over this slide.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Bill, for that great overview of all the alternatives. I just want to get you guys up to speed on new resources we have for businesses and organizations that are or will be going through construction that could inhibit customers to come to either their business or their organization. So I'm going to share my screen with you really quick and show you the Wisconsin Department of Transportation's new In This Together website. So what you're seeing here is the homepage for In This Together, and In This Together just means business resources. That's what we titled our toolkit, basically, for businesses and organizations to help them not only during construction, but for planning before construction. We've included multiple promotional examples, so if you don't want to create your own collateral to reach out to customers, it's already created. You can simply take the designs and copy already developed by certain companies in other places with construction hampering some of the customers coming to their businesses and use it as your own. We also have case studies that run down what businesses did in certain parts of the state when construction came to the road out in front of their driveway. Excellent tips and advice straight from the companies themselves. Perhaps the biggest change is this new road construction guide for businesses. It's a multi-page interactive guide that brings you from the beginning design, like we are here, all the way through to the end of construction. I won't go through every page, but we do have a roadmap here, and it's important to organize early. That's what we're doing right now. With you here, you're organizing and getting ready for the project, learn more about the project, develop questions for project staff. And then as we move along in design, when the alternatives are broken down a little more and then chosen. You want to stay engaged with the project so you know um, the exact traffic um, issues that are going to come during construction. And then as you go along, you want to make sure that you develop a action plan or a game plan for when there is in construction. So how do you do all that? We kind of basically bring you through it with a lot of different resources. Um, This page right here is probably the best as far as tools and tips. What you want to do is hover over the various bubbles, and on the bottom will pop up some tips based on what you're looking for, whether it's communications, promotion, or business activities. Just as an example, a lot of people forget their suppliers have big trucks. If they're in a construction zone, even if it's not a road closure, sometimes the lane widths are smaller. So you want to make sure your suppliers know. Again, excellent tips and advice for whatever your needs are. We also talk about temporary signage guides and the permit to install temporary business signage. It goes through in detail what you can use and how you can go about erecting the signage when construction comes, if there is a detour around your business. And then the rest of it is just some more success stories, um, talking about the end of construction, some tips and ideas for your business or organization, some more resources, a planning guide for a life cycle of transportation, all the way from the beginning where we are now through the end, and then through to maintenance of the structure. And there's just some numbers and some other uh, places you can go to get some tools, tips, and ideas if construction's gonna impact your business. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and send it back to the project team. Bill?
Okay, thanks, Mark. And with that, that brings us to really the question and answer portion of it. So we'll now open the public comment up. As we mentioned at the start of the meeting, we'll start with questions in the chat feature, then go to those who raised their hand, and then last to those that are on the phone. And please remember to unmute your mic before speaking. And also you can enter a question or comment in the chat at any time. Again, we have staff monitoring the written chat and will address your questions. We ask and appreciate your patience as we navigate through the live Teams format and the question and answers. So, and I know right now I do not see any questions in the chat window. Tammy, I don't know if you see uh, any other questions on that.
No, we have not had any questions in the
Okay.
chat. I did add the links to the project website and the In This Together website in the chat, but I have not seen any questions and no one has their hand raised. So if anyone does have any questions, now's the time to raise your hand or type in the chat.
Okay. And we'll just ask any other questions or comments from the chat or the phone. Okay. Last call for questions and comments then.
So you have a chat question, Bill. When does the architectural features of the bridge design happen?
Okay. Yes, thanks for the question. We first will need to select a preferred alternative. Once a preferred alternative is selected, then certainly if it would be a replacement alternative, there would be certainly an opportunity at that time to have further discussions with the local community. Under a rehabilitation option, there would not be really any additional architectural features that would be added. The other major thing to point out as well is that Some people remember a few years back where we had what was called community sensitive solutions or community sensitive design dollars that were federal state dollars that were kind of used at least to start some kind of architectural or aesthetic feature. That program no longer exists. So if there is a desire from the city of Oshkosh or local community for any special aesthetic or architectural features on a replacement option, the local community would need to appropriate local dollars for that. And I know within the Menasha project and the Racine Street Bridge replacement, the City Council of Menasha did approve significant money for some local or some aesthetic features that will be incorporated into that project. Uh, but anyone will need to understand when that bridge opens up in the fall this year, anything you see that special architectural features did come from local or City of Menasha dollars. Okay, again, any additional questions or comments? Okay. If there are no further questions or comments, uh, we are going to conclude the meeting now. What I will do here, and we'll go to the last slide, that does show contact information for both myself and for Mark. Our contact information is also on the project website. And thanks, Tammy, for putting that website in the chat window. That is shown also on the bottom of the last slide here. Uh, so with that, we appreciate everyone attending the meeting this evening. We are now going to stop the recording, and we would ask that everyone please log out or hang up so that the department can conclude the meeting.